Think you know Musashi? Then tell me, have you heard how he stalked other children through the muddy lanes of his village like prey, setting traps and striking with such savage force that even grown men started to avoid the paths he walked? Or how he humiliated the greatest martial clan of Kyoto so thoroughly that their dynasty collapsed into disgrace, with whispers that some of them took their own lives from shame? So stay with this story until the final chilling silence, because at the end of Miyamoto Musashi's road waits a revelation more terrifying than any battlefield, a lesson that might just cut deeper than any of his blades ever could. The world you first opened your eyes to was a fractured one, a restless land clawing at itself, soaked in the tension of endless rivalries. Japan was a patchwork of ambitious warlords and fragile alliances, where yesterday's friend could become today's conqueror with the flick of a blade. If a newborn could judge the world into which he arrived, you might have labeled it a storm masquerading as a country. Your first breath carried the scent of smoke drifting down from distant battles. Your earliest lullabies were not soft songs, but the echo of distant war drums, their low, deliberate cadence thrumming through the soil of your village like a warning. You were born in a modest settlement tucked among the rugged hills of Harima, a patch of earth that tried its best to keep living while great armies marched just beyond the horizon. There were no silk wrappings for you, no gentle hands fretting over the delicate skin of an infant born to privilege. Instead, rough homespun cloth scratched at your tiny limbs, and the cold crept in wherever it found room. Your mother cradled you with a tenderness that couldn't mask her exhaustion, while your father's hands were hard and calloused, more accustomed to gripping a sword hilt than a fragile new life. Even then, though you could not comprehend it, your arrival was less a tender miracle and more the forging of a tool your father intended to sharpen. Shinmen Munisai, your father, was a man molded by the same cruel hands that shaped all warriors of that era. His stern eyes missed nothing. The set of his jaw made it clear he was not built for gentle smiles or playful teasing. Where other fathers might have hoped to see their children grow fat with laughter and mischief, he looked into your scrappy, squirming little form and saw raw material, something to be shaped, hardened, directed. From your earliest days, softness was not a language your family spoke. Warmth was rationed, affection was a rumor, and praise was a treasure locked away somewhere you'd likely never see. Your tiny body learned early how to cling to life in the face of biting wind and lean seasons. Hunger became a familiar ache. The rough ground of your village's hard-packed streets was as much your nursery as your family's humble home. You toddled through muddy lanes with little more than sun-bleached rags around your waist, your feet caked with dirt, your hair matted from sweat and soil. Other children learned to bow politely, to recite small bits of poetry that pleased visiting elders. You, on the other hand, learned how to crouch behind trees, to stay low and spring forward at just the right moment to surprise your playmates. It was a crude game of ambushes that earned you as many scrapes and bruises as victories. But each fall was simply another lesson in rising quickly and more carefully. By the time your legs carried you with more confidence than clumsiness, your father decided play had ended. His eyes saw your growth not with a parent's gentle wonder, but with the appraising calculation of a smith judging steel. One morning, he placed a wooden sword in your small hands. It was poorly balanced, slightly splintered along the guard, and heavier than it looked. Your wrists trembled under its unfamiliar weight. Munasai's only instruction was a curt nod. You were expected to understand. Training was not some dramatic ritual under cherry blossoms with poetic declarations about honor. It was grueling, relentless, and startlingly indifferent to your pain. Your father's philosophy was simple. The sooner you felt the bite of failure, the sooner you'd grow strong enough to avoid it. If you stumbled under the weight of a strike, he did not lower his own practice blade to help you rise.
Instead, he pressed his advantage, driving home the lesson that the world offered no gentle hands. While other boys might end their afternoons with treats or warm cups of barley tea, your evenings were spent nursing fresh bruises that bloomed across your shoulders and ribs like dark flowers. If your father noticed your wounds, he offered no soothing words. Survival was its own reward. Praise, if it ever came, was hidden behind his silent approval each time you managed to block or dodge a fraction faster than before. But there was something in you that stubbornly thrived under this harsh tutelage. Each blow that knocked the breath from your lungs seemed to fan a spark deeper inside. You began to watch your father not as a figure to be feared, but as a puzzle to be solved. You noted the tiny shifts of his weight, the narrowing of his eyes just before he struck. You learned to see more than muscle. You learned to read intent. By your 13th year, your body had grown lean and wiry, your reflexes sharp in ways that unsettled even the older boys in your village. Whispers began to swirl around you. Mothers pulled their children closer when you walked by, whispering about the wild-eyed son of Musashi who never seemed to flinch, even when blood ran down his shin or across his cheek. Some nodded with cautious respect. Others simply looked away. You were different, they decided. Different and perhaps dangerous. And perhaps they were right, because one humid afternoon, when most boys your age were learning to snare small fish or carve bamboo whistles, you found yourself standing barefoot in the dust opposite a grown samurai named Arima Kihei. He had wandered into town full of the arrogance common to men who wore fine swords and carried the names of reputable schools. Perhaps he thought to impress your villagers by besting a few local toughs to collect their admiration like coins in a purse. What he did not expect was you. When word of the challenge spread, people came running. They crowded around the makeshift dueling ground, eyes wide with a mix of dread and curiosity. Even your own family watched you with expressions you couldn't quite decipher. Equal parts worry, disbelief, and something colder. They didn't expect you to win. Most didn't even expect you to survive. After all, you were barely past childhood, still with sunburnt shoulders and a head full of stubborn ideas. But you felt none of their fear. What filled your chest was something steadier, a quiet certainty that this was precisely where you were meant to stand. When the fight began, you didn't bow with elaborate ceremony. You didn't recite any clever verses. You lunged forward like a storm breaking over calm fields. The samurai's smirk faltered as you closed the distance faster than he anticipated, your wooden blade striking with a raw, unpolished ferocity that sent him sprawling in the dirt. A stunned silence fell. Even the birds seemed to pause, as if unsure how to resume their songs. Then the murmur started. A 13-year-old villager boy had bested a trained samurai. No tricks, no fluke, just sheer, unexpected force and cunning. When you turned to glance at your father, he did not clap or shout or even nod. But there was a glimmer in his eyes, brief, quickly shuttered, that told you all you needed to know. You had stepped beyond the boundaries he once drew around your future. From that day, the horizon began calling to you with a voice you couldn't ignore. There would be no simple life for you tending rice paddies or patching roofs. You were meant for the road, for the endless challenge of strangers and their blades, for the chance to carve your name not into wood or stone, but into the wary breath of every swordsman who might one day hear of you. So, at 15, with no ceremony, no tearful farewells, you left. You tied your few belongings into a rough bundle, slung your sword over your shoulder, and walked out of Miyamoto village. Your feet found the paths that snaked through pine forests and across bright rivers, each step taking you farther from home and deeper into the unknown. The road welcomed you with its own brutal honesty. Cold rains that soaked you through, nights spent curled beneath hedges while foxes barked in the distance, meals that were often nothing more than hand-sized lumps of cold rice, or nothing at all. But you were free. Free in a way few men ever taste. No master's banner to kneel under, no courtly etiquette to polish your speech or your posture. You belonged only to yourself and the road, and it became your true teacher. The wilderness sharpened your instincts. Hunger taught patience far more effectively than any old master. Even loneliness proved its worth, forcing you to turn inward, to measure your own mettle without the echo of other voices. Whenever you stumbled across a village dojo, curiosity, or perhaps arrogance, drove you through their gates. You challenged their best students, eager not simply to win, but to learn. Each duel became another step in your education. When you triumphed, you studied not just your opponent's failures, but your own small hesitations. When you were pushed to the brink, you discovered reserves of will you hadn't known existed. Your technique grew stranger, leaner, more unpredictable. You began to realize that the sword was not merely an object to be swung. It was an extension of thought itself. Every feint was a question. Every parry a conversation with the opponent's doubts. Word of you started to ripple across provinces. A young ronin with a wild look and a blade faster than common sense. Some called you brilliant. Others labeled you mad. Either way, your path was becoming something larger than you could quite see yet, and you welcomed it, step, unsteady, exhilarating step. Your father, Shinmen Munisai, was many things to many people. A respected swordsman under the Ashikaga shogunate, a man whose victories were whispered about in sake shops and across temple courtyards. But to you, he was less apparent and more an unrelenting forge. Where other children found in their fathers a sturdy shelter from the world's harshness, you found only a sharper edge, a colder flame that burned away softness wherever it tried to grow. Word of you started to ripple across provinces. A young ronin with a wild look and a blade faster than common sense. Some called you brilliant. Others labeled you mad. Either way, your path was becoming something larger than you could quite see yet, and you welcomed it, step, unsteady, exhilarating step. Your father, Shinmen Munisai, was many things to many people. A respected swordsman under the Ashikaga shogunate, a man whose victories were whispered about in sake shops and across temple courtyards. But to you, he was less apparent and more an unrelenting forge. Where other children found in their fathers a sturdy shelter from the world's harshness, you found only a sharper edge, a colder flame that burned away softness wherever it tried to grow.
Munisai did not treat you cruelly out of simple malice. His brand of severity was calculated, purposeful, as if he were constantly weighing in his mind how much heat you could withstand before the steel of your spirit cracked. He never called you son in the tender way some fathers did. Instead, he addressed you with clipped words and expectant silences, as though speaking to a tool he was still deciding how best to shape. In truth, you were never just a child to him. You were a future weapon, still rough, still flawed, but already destined for battle. The earliest lessons he offered you were not written down in graceful brushstrokes on fine scrolls. They were carved into your skin and bones through repetition so relentless it bordered on ritual. Each morning began before the mist had even finished lifting from the village paths. You would rise at his command, shoulders stiff from sleeping on thin mats, limbs protesting with the dull ache of bruises not yet faded from the day before. Without a word, he would thrust a practice sword into your hands, sometimes made of wood, sometimes weighted with metal so that even holding it forced your muscles into a trembling strain. He did not instruct you with gentle corrections. When your form faltered, when your wrists wobbled, or your stance betrayed a fraction of hesitation, he struck. Not out of rage. His face remained calm, eyes flat, as though assessing the grain of lumber he planned to hew. The blow would come quick, cold, with just enough force to drop you to one knee. You learned not to look at him for sympathy. There was none. Sympathy in his eyes was a poison that softened the mind. What he offered instead was the clearest truth you could ever receive. A mistake, however slight, would be punished by the world without pause or pity. Better you learn that from him now than from a sharper blade later.
In those first years, your days blurred into a punishing rhythm of drills and beatings. Evenings were spent nursing welts that formed dark constellations across your arms and shoulders. If you dared let tears slip down your cheeks, Musashi ignored them as easily as he ignored the wind rattling through the house's thin walls. Tears were nothing. They changed nothing. Pain was a language you had to become fluent in, for it would be your constant companion long after childhood passed. Yet, within the grinding hardship of these days, something unexpected took root. A fascination began to grow inside you, strange, glinting, irresistible. Each time you faced your father, battered and breathless, you found yourself studying him with more than dread. You noted how his weight rested on the balls of his feet, even at rest, how his breath seemed to slow in the instant before he struck. You absorbed the subtle flex and release of his muscles, the way he turned his body so his center never lost balance. Without realizing it, you began to mirror him, to imitate not just his movements, but his focus, his chill appraisal of every opening and flaw. At night, long after your father had set aside his swords and retreated into the quiet of his own grim thoughts, you lay awake, replaying every clash of your wooden blade against his. You saw again and again the moments you had failed, each slip of footing, each careless angle of your whist that had earned you a fresh bruise. And with each replay, a part of you whispered how it might have been avoided. The next morning, driven by that midnight counsel, you corrected yourself before he needed to. Slowly, painfully, Musashi's sharp lessons carved deeper than your skin. They sank into the marrow of who you were becoming. Your father rarely spoke of pride. The closest he came was a faint narrowing of his eyes on the days you managed to hold your ground half a heartbeat longer before his strike broke through. Once, when you blocked a blow that would have sent you sprawling the week before, he simply grunted, adjusted his grip, and attacked again. It was not approval. Approval was a luxury for lesser men. But it was enough. You felt it all the same, a pulse of dark satisfaction that lit your chest for an instant before vanishing under the next flurry of hits. Among the villagers, tales of Musashi's duels still lingered like smoke. They remembered the contests he won under the scrutiny of powerful lords, the way his blade danced so precisely it seemed to mock the slower efforts of his opponents. Some men revered him, others resented him, but all respected the danger he represented. You grew up hearing these murmurs and seeing the caution with which they addressed him, and by extension you. Even before your own reputation began to form, you carried the weight of his victories on your narrow shoulders. In this crucible of discipline, love was a concept you gradually unlearned. Not because your father despised you, far from it. In his own severe way, he believed he was giving you the greatest gift he could. A son coddled by warmth would splinter at the first real strike life delivered. A son hardened by ceaseless trial might stand unbroken where others fell. What he failed to see, perhaps, was that in forging you into a weapon, he was also forging the distance that would one day make it easy for you to walk away. But for now, you accepted it. You drank down his harshness like bitter medicine, because somewhere in your bones, you understood it was shaping you into something sharper than even his keenest steel. While other boys clung to dreams of safe futures, fields full of ripening grain, laughter echoing through small rooms, you dreamed of blade and breath, of the cold clarity that came only in those split seconds when everything balanced on the edge of a single cut. And slowly, without even realizing it, you stopped being merely a boy beneath his hand. You became something leaner, quicker, your spirit tempered by his relentless strikes. When he looked at you across the practice yard, it was not with the eyes of a father gazing at his child. It was the measured, considering look of a craftsman inspecting a sword he had spent years refining. Not finished yet, no, but close. Close enough that even Musashi, in the privacy of his thoughts, might have wondered if one day the blade he'd sharpened would cut in directions he could neither predict nor control.
Long before you were old enough to understand strategy or honor, your instincts drove you to play in ways that had less to do with childish joy and more to do with a raw, predatory curiosity. The dusty lanes of your village were your proving grounds, their tangled footpaths and small gardens offering endless terrain for the games you invented, games that startled even the older boys with their intensity. Where most children chased each other in circles, squealing and laughing until they collapsed in heaps, your amusement came from something far more primal. You liked to disappear. You'd crouch in thickets of high summer grass or fold yourself behind wood piles stacked at the edge of someone's yard, your breath held tight in your lungs, waiting, watching. The sun overhead scorched your bare shoulders. Insects crawled across your arms, but you stayed perfectly still. And when your chosen moment came, when your unsuspecting playmates wandered too close, you burst forth in a blur of bony limbs, knocking them over with a triumphant bark that was half laughter, half savage cry. Some ran crying to their mothers, scraped knees and shocked tears painting them as victims. Others learned quickly to be wary, their eyes darting to every tree trunk and narrow alley, expecting your sudden onslaught. The game changed because of you. It became a contest of patience and cunning, of who could stay hidden the longest, who could circle behind whom without being caught. Without realizing it, you were teaching them a crude version of the lessons your father hammered into you daily, that vigilance was life, and that an inattentive heart was little more than an open door to pain. Yet there was more to your wildness than simple ambushes. The rough boys of Miyamoto often gathered to test themselves in wrestling matches or stick fights, their skinny arms swinging with all the reckless abandon of youth. You joined these scraps eagerly, but never quite like the others did. They fought for the thrill of it, to impress the older boys who lounged nearby pretending not to watch. You fought with a seriousness that puzzled them, your eyes narrow and bright, your lips curled not in playful challenge, but in something closer to concentration. When you tackled them, it was low and hard, driving your shoulder into their ribs the way you'd watched your father drive his weight into practice strikes. When your opponent stumbled, you didn't wait for him to catch his breath or find his footing again. You pressed, relentless, until he was pinned flat or fleeing with his arms flung over his head. It wasn't cruelty that spurred you, though a few mothers accused you of exactly that when they saw their sons limp home bruised and dusty. It was a drive you couldn't name, a need to test not just them, but yourself, to see if the lessons of the yard behind your house held true in the chaotic swirl of scrabbling hands and shifting feet. Sometimes you wondered if you were meant to be this way. Other boys laughed more easily, clung to each other's shoulders after a scuffle, grinning through bloodied lips. You found laughter a stranger thing, something that happened by accident rather than design, bursting out of you in short, sharp barks that startled even you. What felt natural instead was focus, your heartbeat slowing in the instant before you lunged, your mind cold and clear as you calculated how best to upend a rival's balance. There were whispers already. Adults spoke of you in lowered voices, casting sidelong glances if you happened to shuffle by on your way to fetch water. They called you wild, feral, said the boy of Musashi carried shadows in his eyes too dark for someone so young. You might have been hurt by this if you understood it as rejection, but you didn't. You wore it instead like a second skin. If they saw a small predator in you, let them. It was easier than pretending to be something softer. The other children learned to navigate you carefully. Some sought to win your favor by mimicking your methods, crouching in bushes and leaping out with awkward war cries that fell flat, their eyes darting to see if you approved. Others kept wide circles around you, their games drifting to other corners of the village whenever you appeared, unable to shake the feeling that your gaze was measuring them in ways that went beyond mere mischief. Still, even in your rawest moments, there was no malice for its own sake. The world around you was simply something to be read and reacted to, moving shapes, patterns to exploit. When a flock of sparrows scattered from a rice field,
You chased them not with squeals of delight, but with a keen-eyed fascination, studying how they wheeled and turned together, how one motion triggered another, how hesitation left a straggler vulnerable. These were small lessons then, filed away in the back of your mind without ceremony. Later, standing across from men who sought your end with drawn steel, you would recall those sparrows more vividly than any old chant of honor. So your days unwound in this rough tapestry of quiet observation and sudden violence. You scraped your knees not on garden paths, but on the bark of trees you climbed to spy on passing travelers. Your elbows stained green from hours spent lying belly down on mossy banks, watching frogs tense and leap. You measured every boy in the village by how quickly he flinched, how easily his eyes darted away. And somewhere under the sunburn and scabs, under the tangles of dirt-caked hair, a mind was forming that understood the world as a place of perpetual contests, where survival was less about fairness and more about who noticed first, who struck first, who refused to retreat even when the odds wavered.
In this way, your father's harsh lessons were never confined to the practice yard. They lived in you always, stitched into your very posture, your sharp, curious stare, your habit of standing just slightly off-center so no one could approach without your noticing. While other children learned the soft choreography of village courtesy, you honed something more primal. And without quite knowing it, you were preparing for a life in which every day might be a duel, some with swords, some only with glances and unspoken threats, but all of them demanding the same ruthless clarity. Your earliest memories of weapons were splinters, not gleaming blades resting on ornate stands or polished by careful hands. No, your first companions were rough-hewn wooden swords that bit into your palms, leaving thin slices that wept blood and turned your grip slick. These crude bakken were your daily burden, thrust upon you by a father who believed comfort was nothing but poison in disguise. At first, your small hands fumbled under their awkward weight. The wooden practice swords were too long, too poorly balanced for your still-growing arms, and each swing threatened to twist your wrists or jar your elbows with a shock that ran straight to your teeth. When you stumbled under their demands, your father's eyes held no pity. He watched with the same cold calculation a falcon might give to a struggling chick, unmoved by the struggle itself, interested only in whether the chick would stand again or simply give up and die. The lessons came fast, unrelenting. Mornings blurred into afternoons filled with the dry slap of wood against wood, your arms shaking from the endless repetitions of cuts and parries. Evenings brought darker lessons. You were sent to bed with shoulders raw from fresh welts, skin raised in angry knots where your father's strikes found their mark. You tried at first to hide your pain, to clench your teeth and swallow back any sound that might be mistaken for weakness. But Musashi had no need of your silence. He saw everything in the minute tightening of your jaw, the flinch you failed to suppress. And each sign of softness only drew harsher correction. It was in these bruising hours that you first began to understand something fundamental about the world. Pain was not merely punishment, it was instruction. Every sting along your ribs, every numbing throb that lingered in your forearms after a particularly savage block taught you exactly how close you had come to a mistake that would cost you dearly if the swords were real. Under your father's watch, error was an opportunity, an opening he exploited with merciless precision to burn each lesson deeper. Other villagers might have pitied the small boy with the wild hair and hollow eyes, forced to spar until sweat mingled with blood. They would have shaken their heads and whispered that Musashi was raising a monster. Perhaps he was, but inside you, something else began to grow, a hard, bright core that thrived on these trials. While others might have broken under such demands, you found a savage clarity in them. You started to crave the moments when everything narrowed to the simple choice between strike or be struck.
Your body toughened long before it properly filled out. The wooden blade that once felt impossibly heavy now moved in your grip as an extension of thought, its weight something you accounted for without conscious effort. Where your arms were once thin and awkward, they became ropes of muscle hardened by the 1,000 small corrections your father's training forced upon you. Your back learned to twist and torque, your legs learned to anchor and launch. Each part of you adjusted under the tyranny of necessity. More important still was what took shape behind your eyes. Pain honed more than your body. It sharpened your mind in ways no gentle instruction could. You began to watch your father differently. Instead of flinching when his stance shifted, you anticipated the shift, reading the tiny tightening at his shoulders that meant a strike was coming. The first time you moved before his sword landed, parrying with a clumsy, desperate swipe, something electric lit up inside your chest. It was as if a lock had clicked open. You had not simply endured the lesson, you had absorbed it, reshaped it, turned it back on its giver. Musashi paused only for the briefest moment, his eyes narrowing as if measuring a new shape in the metal he had been hammering all these years. Then he resumed, even faster, driving you harder. Because in that instant, he recognized you were no longer merely enduring, you were evolving. It was also then that a darker understanding rooted itself in your young heart. Watching your father's relentless eyes, feeling each fresh bruise bloom under your skin, you realized that the world did not reward the kind or the cautious. Mercy was a luxury for those who could afford it. Hesitation was a death sentence, if not delivered by your opponent's blade, then by the slow erosion of your own will. You began to see that to survive, to truly thrive, you would have to be both clever and a little cruel. This did not mean you took pleasure in hurting others. Even at your most raw, you did not become some simple sadist delighting in another's pain. But you shed any illusions about fairness or gentle sportsmanship. Life was a contest of edges, and the sharper mind, the sharper instinct, always prevailed. When you fought, whether with sticks against village boys or under your father's unflinching gaze, you did so with a growing ruthlessness. You learned to watch for the flicker in another's eyes that said fear was about to take hold. You pressed in exactly at that moment, striking not just at the body, but at the fragile architecture of another's courage. Each evening, as you lay on your thin mat, muscles twitching from exhaustion, you traced the fresh bruises on your ribs with absent fingers. They were maps of your education, proof of your progress. And though you never would have dared say it aloud, certainly never to Musashi, a part of you felt almost grateful for them. Each tender ache was a promise that tomorrow you would be harder, faster, less likely to make the same mistake. So the wooden swords became your first true friends, more honest than any human voice could be. They spoke clearly of consequence. They had no patience for excuses or tears. Under their tutelage, you grew not just into a boy who could wield a blade, but into something leaner and far more dangerous, a mind that understood survival was a game won by those who refused to be slow or sentimental. In time, that same mind would see opportunity in every conflict, would smell weakness like a wolf scenting blood. But it all began there, in the dirt yard behind your home, with a wooden sword that taught you pain was not your enemy. Pain was simply the whisper of the world telling you to adapt or be left behind. And you listened. By the time you crossed the fragile threshold between boyhood and what others began to call manhood, your name was already carried on cautious lips through the narrow lanes of Miyamoto. Mothers warned their sons to keep their distance, not out of malice, but because there was something in your eyes that unsettled them, a watchfulness too keen, a hunger that had nothing to do with food. Even so, The village remained your proving ground. You shadowed older boys during their idle duels with bamboo sticks, sometimes stepping in to challenge them outright. Your strikes too hard, too fast, leaving them clutching at smarting ribs and blinking back tears. They learned to avoid your gaze, but you could see it, a begrudging respect tempered by an undercurrent of fear. It was this growing murmur around your name that set the stage for everything that followed. Word traveled quickly in small places, and it traveled even faster when it concerned something as primal as the promise of violence. So when a traveling samurai named Arima Kihei arrived in your village, an arrogant man from a local martial school eager to demonstrate his skill and lord it over these rustic peasants, the whispers naturally found their way to him. Kihei was everything you were not. Well-fed, well-groomed, his armor lacquered to a glossy sheen, his swords polished so that even the indifferent sun seemed to pause to admire them. He carried himself with the easy disdain of someone who believed a pedigree in swordsmanship was worth more than any real edge. When he first heard the villagers speak your name, he laughed. A boy of 13 with a wooden practice sword? It amused him. He encouraged the crowd's gossip, letting their eager anticipation build. What better way to cement his reputation than by publicly humbling the feral little whelp of Musashi? It would be a performance, a lark, something for the villagers to chatter about long after he continued down the road. The duel was arranged almost casually. There were no formal declarations, no scrolls of challenge penned by trembling scribes. The villagers simply gathered, drawn by the irresistible pull of spectacle, by the same curiosity that makes people crowd around the site of a cart accident. They formed a ragged circle on the hard earth outside the village, children perched on fence rails, old men sucking nervously at their pipes. Even your own family stood among them, their faces hard to read. You wondered if your father was there at all, silent in the crowd, his eyes narrowed as he measured what he had forged. When Kihei strode into the circle, he wore a thin, condescending smile. His hand rested easily on the hilt of his sword, his armor catching the light in brilliant flashes that made the villagers squint. You stood opposite him, barefoot, your feet calloused and dark with dust, wearing the same simple tunic you always did. In your hands was your wooden sword, rough and darkened with years of sweat. It looked laughably inadequate beside the polished steel Kihei displayed. A few snickers rippled through the onlookers, quickly swallowed by nervous coughs. But inside you, there was no laughter. There was only the quiet, icy stillness you had come to trust more than any friend. As Kihei offered a mocking bow, his hand never far from his blade, you simply watched, studied, the way his weight shifted, the slight tightening of his jaw, the overconfident slouch of his shoulders that told you he expected this to be over in a single swing. And in that moment, you felt something bright and cold bloom in your chest, not unlike joy, but sharper. This was not a game. This was everything you had been honed for. Then he moved. A quick, almost lazy step forward, sword flashing free in a silver arc meant to impress as much as to cut. But your body was already ahead of your thoughts. You surged in, low and sudden, your bare feet biting into the earth. The wooden sword you gripped like an old conspirator snapped up and across with all the savage force your lean frame could muster. It struck Kihei not delicately, not with the measured restraint of practice bouts, but with the raw, brutal commitment of someone who understood that hesitation was a luxury reserved for corpses. The crack of wood meeting flesh rang out like a breaking branch. Kihei's eyes widened in stunned disbelief as his own momentum carried him helplessly forward. Your second strike came before his gasp could even fully form, a hard, diagonal blow that rattled down his shoulder and drove the breath from his lungs in a pained grunt. The samurai stumbled, his polished sword dropping to the dirt, his knees buckling under a weight he had never planned to carry, the shock of his own sudden defeat. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to pause. Even the restless wind stilled. Then Kihei crumpled, clutching at the side of his head, blood seeping between his fingers, his carefully oiled hair matted dark. The villagers inhaled as one, their collective gasp breaking the spell. Someone's child began to wail, startled by the sight of real injury in a place where such contests were usually harmless. You stood there, breathing hard, your chest rising and falling as though you'd been running for miles. Not from exhaustion, your body felt alive in a way it never had before, every nerve singing, but from the electric charge of understanding that snapped through you. All those years of bruises, of wooden swords biting your skin, of your father's cold lessons, they had culminated here. In the end, there was no ceremony, no pretty speeches, just instinct and the willingness to do what the other man thought unthinkable. When you glanced at the faces surrounding you, you saw something new. No longer simply suspicion or idle curiosity. Now there was awe, edged with fear. They would speak of this for weeks, months, maybe years. The boy who brought down a trained samurai with nothing but a wooden sword and a hungry look in his eyes. And somewhere in the crowd, perhaps unseen, you imagined your father watching, his arms folded tight. Not smiling, he never wasted himself on that, but perhaps allowing a single nod, small and almost imperceptible. It was enough. Because deep inside you now coiled a truth that would guide you more faithfully than any creed. Survival did not belong to the strongest or the most beautifully armed. It belonged to those who could see through the illusions of power and strike with neither hesitation nor remorse. That day, the dirt of Miyamoto drank both dust and blood. And you walked away from it not a boy victorious, but something leaner and colder, someone who understood that the real art of the sword was not merely in cutting flesh, but in cutting through the fragile illusions men wrapped around themselves to feel safe. You would never be that naive again. Your father stood at the edge of the gathered crowd, arms crossed over his chest, his expression as stern and inscrutable as ever. For a moment after the duel ended, your gaze caught his across the dusty ring, hoping, almost against reason, to find a spark of triumph there, some small release of tension that would tell you he was proud. But Munasai's face did not soften. His eyes moved over you the way a smith inspects a blade fresh from the quench, searching for warps or cracks that might betray hidden weakness. Yet beneath that hard, assessing stare, you glimpsed something unexpected, a narrow flare, quick and uneasy, that settled in the lines around his eyes before he managed to bury it again. It was not relief, not pride. It was closer to caution, a fleeting recognition that whatever force he had spent years hammering into shape under his roof had now slipped fully beyond his command. In the hushed breath of that shared look, you understood he saw it too. The boy he had sought to make into a weapon had become one in truth, honed sharper by necessity than by any lesson he could have delivered. And now that edge was something even he might hesitate to grasp. Your mother, standing just behind him, pressed her lips together and turned away, hiding a tremor in her hands that could have been fear or a desperate wish to unsee what had just unfolded. The other villagers kept their distance, drawing subtle lines of space around you as though the violence might still be clinging to your skin. Where once they might have tousled your hair or called out mild rebukes when you barreled through the streets, now their eyes lingered warily, their mouths thinning into tight, uneasy lines. Walking home through that newly parted sea of bodies felt different from all your previous small triumphs. The air seemed to carry your name ahead of you like a dark herald, each whisper punctuating your steps with threads of rumor that you could almost hear forming. Too young, too fierce, too dangerous to simply be the son of a village swordsman. Your feet felt unusually light on the packed dirt path, not from relief, but because something deep inside you had slipped its final tether. When the quiet of evening settled over your home, Musashi did not summon you to the yard for more drills. He sat on the worn stoop with a distant stare, his sword across his knees, his fingers absently tracing the hilt. You paused at the threshold, half expecting a summons, maybe even a blow meant to remind you who stood about whom. But he only looked up briefly, his eyes catching yours in a glance that held none of the usual sharp instruction. Instead, there was an unspoken acknowledgement, an almost reluctant acceptance, that you were no longer the small, mud-caked child he could shape with brute discipline. You realized in that moment that your path was set, carved out by the hard years of relentless lessons, and sealed now by blood drawn from a man who had entered your village laughing and left it broken. There would be no returning to simpler days, no chance to become the farmer's son or the modest craftsman who might one day inherit a quiet shop. Whatever future you might have lived before that duel lay discarded in the dust with the samurai's fallen pride. Later that night, lying on your thin mat with sleep slow to come, you stared into the dim rafters and let the truth sink deeper. The life ahead would not be measured by harvests or village festivals, but by the steady rhythm of footsteps on unknown roads, by the feel of calloused hands wrapping tighter around a sword's hilt. Somewhere beyond your small world of fields and low wooden houses waited other men like Arima Kihei, carrying blades gleaming in the sun, their smiles thin with overconfidence. The thought did not frighten you. If anything, it pulled at you with an eager heat, a quiet certainty that only out there could you test the shape you had become. When you closed your eyes at last, you found no dreams of warm hearths or gentle futures. Instead, you saw the flash of your wooden sword striking home, heard again the startled cry of a man who underestimated you, felt the ripple of power that came from standing firm when the world expected you to fall. And in that memory, you sensed the first true taste of what lay waiting beyond your village, an uncharted expanse of challengers, each one another step towards some deeper mastery you could not yet fully name. By morning, the decision was already alive inside you, silent but unmovable. The road was coming. You would not wait long to meet it. You rose before dawn in those final days at home, the air still heavy with mist that clung to the low eaves of your father's house. Inside, your mother moved quietly about her chores, the sound of water pouring into wooden buckets soft as a distant memory. Your father sat by the narrow doorway, sharpening his blade with long, deliberate strokes. The rasp of stone on steel was a sound so woven into your childhood it had become almost like breathing. Yet, that morning, it rang differently in your ears, a low reminder that every path you had ever walked led here. No speeches were given. You did not gather your family to announce your departure. In truth, you knew there was little to say. Your father had spent years stripping your life of softness, teaching you that the world was not built to cradle delicate things. To plead for blessings or ask permission would have betrayed everything he had instilled in you. So instead, you packed quietly. A threadbare travel cloak that still smelled faintly of hearth smoke, a small bundle of dried rice, your practice sword, though by now it was less a training tool and more a familiar extension of your own arm. When you finally stepped across the threshold, your mother paused in her work. Her eyes met yours for a single moment, dark and shining with something too complicated to name. She did not rush forward to embrace you. She did not plead with you to stay. Perhaps she understood as clearly as you did that the boy who might have lived his whole life within these village boundaries had already ceased to exist the day you bested a samurai in front of trembling neighbors. Your father neither rose nor spoke. His hand continued its steady motion along the length of the blade, drawing sparks that glowed for a heartbeat before vanishing into the cool morning air. But when your foot touched the packed dirt path leading away from the house, you felt his gaze settle on your back, heavy, measuring, and, in its own austere way, approving. He had forged you for this, even if it meant watching you disappear beyond the edges of everything he could still control. The village did not wake to see you go. Chickens clucked sleepily in their pens, a thin trail of smoke climbed from a distant cooking fire, and somewhere a cart creaked under the weight of early produce. You left it all behind without turning for a last look. Nostalgia was a sentiment you had never been taught to nurture. What waited for you out there was harsh, uncertain, likely cruel, but it was yours alone, unshaped by anyone's hand but your own. The first days were a study in hardship. Hunger greeted you like an old rival, grinning at the pit of your stomach as the meager rice supply dwindled. The nights bit at your skin with cold teeth, leaving your bones aching by morning. You learned to find what little shelter the roadside offered, curling under low bushes, pressing your back against the trunks of ancient cedars, pulling your thin cloak tight around your shoulders as dew gathered in your hair. And yet, despite the raw discomfort, there was an exhilaration that coursed through you with every muddy step. For the first time, you felt the true weight of your own choices. Each mile was carved from nothing but your will to keep walking. No master's voice commanded you forward. No promise of comfort waited at the end of any road. It was freedom in its most unvarnished form. Freedom that reeked of sweat and stale bread, that scraped your feet raw and left your stomach clawing at itself, but freedom nonetheless. The landscape rolled out before you, indifferent to your arrival. Fields stretched into thick woodlands that whispered with unseen life. Rivers curled across the land like bright veins. You passed through tiny hamlets where people eyed you with the polite wariness reserved for wanderers. They marked your rough clothes, the sword slung casually at your side, and decided quickly to keep their conversations short. A handful of them offered rice or water, more from fear than charity. You accepted these gifts with a nod, not bothering to hide the sharp way your eyes continued to scan for hidden threats. At night, you lay on cold ground and studied the stars, tracing their familiar scatter across the sky. In their silent, patient glow, you found a strange kinship. Fixed points in a shifting world, each burning with its own purpose, untouched by the petty fears of men. It soothed something inside you to know that beyond the reach of all human ambition, some truths remained constant. Slowly, day by day, your stride grew stronger. The ragged discomfort of travel became less an ordeal and more a ritual. Each ache and pang a reminder that you were forging yourself anew, outside the shadow of your father's yard, beyond the cautious gossip of your village. You began to measure time not by the rising and setting of the sun, but by the distance between one duel and the next, by how many lessons you could wrest from each new encounter.
And so you moved ever onward, chasing something you could not yet name, a horizon that seemed to retreat with every step you took, beckoning you deeper into the rough tapestry of Japan's war-scarred provinces. Behind you, the village of Miyamoto faded into little more than a memory, a place that had given you form but could no longer contain your purpose. Ahead lay only the open road, hard and unpromising, waiting to see if you were truly as sharp and unyielding as you believed. The road did not welcome you with open arms. It greeted you more like an indifferent host who offered neither shelter nor comfort, forcing you to carve out your own space with sheer determination. From the moment you stepped beyond the reach of familiar fields, you discovered that the world beyond village fences was raw, untamed, and cared nothing for your ambitions.
The first real nights as a wanderer were spent under canopies of twisting branches, where wind whispered through the leaves in a language both soothing and vaguely threatening. The ground was hard, littered with stones and roots that found every tender place along your spine. When dawn broke, you rose with limbs stiff and chilled to the marrow, dew soaking the edges of your thin cloak until it clung to your shoulders like cold hands. Hunger became a patient teacher, drilling lessons that no human master ever could. You learned how to stretch a handful of rice over an entire day, how to chew bark until your jaw ached just to distract yourself from the hollow ache in your gut. Wild berries tempted you with their bright skins, but you quickly discovered that some promises of sweetness ended in burning throats and days spent doubled over in agony. The lesson was simple. Not everything that beckons is meant to sustain you. The creatures of the road were your first true companions. Half-wild dogs slunk along village edges, rib cages stark beneath mangy fur, their eyes sharp with the same cautious hunger that lived in your own chest. At night, they sometimes drew near, sniffing at the scraps you hoarded, testing the boundary between fear and need. You respected them for their wariness. They did not beg. They waited, watched, and only moved closer when certain it would not cost them more than it gave. In a way, you felt kin to them, rough things surviving by their instincts alone, trusting no promise that did not prove itself through action.
Crows tracked your progress from above, black shapes wheeling against gray skies, their cries harsh as laughter. They watched as you picked over abandoned fields, or rummaged through small shrines left in the care of no one, gathering what meager offerings villagers once left for restless spirits. Sometimes you tossed them crusts you could spare, marveling at how they descended in a flurry of feathers, bold and greedy. Their quick, clever eyes seemed to mock you, as if to say they too understood how to live on scraps, how to turn carrion into survival. Dust became another companion, clinging to your skin and hair until you looked like a figure carved from the very roads you traveled. It caked into the lines of your palms, settled under your fingernails, dulled the once bright wood of your sword's hilt. You stopped noticing after a time. Cleanliness was a concern for people with steady roofs over their heads, for those who measured life by the neatness of their homes rather than by how quickly they could react to danger. It was in these harsh days that your body began to change in ways even your father's drills had not accomplished. Constant travel hardened your feet until sharp stones became minor irritants instead of causes for stumbling. Your shoulders toughened under the weight of your small bundle. Your legs learned a tireless rhythm that could carry you across entire provinces without complaint. More than this, your mind found a new edge. It learned to exist in a state of constant alertness, tracking every shift in the underbrush, every strange silence that might mean hidden eyes watching from the trees. Villages came and went, some no more than clusters of huts with wary faces peering from behind sliding doors. Sometimes you earned a bowl of rice or a corner by the hearth in exchange for sweeping a yard or carrying heavy loads that older backs could no longer bear. Other times you found only closed gates and curt refusals, people unwilling to gamble on the charity of a stranger with a sword at his hip and a look that spoke of long days without gentle company. Through it all, you spoke little. Words seemed wasteful when the language of survival was written in glances, in the tightening of your grip on the wooden hilt, in the subtle shift of your weight whenever an unknown figure appeared on the horizon. You slept light, the smallest crack of a twig rousing you, hand already closing around your weapon before your eyes fully opened. Each dawn greeted you with another chance to learn the oldest lesson of all, that the world did not care if you struggled, if you froze, if your belly ached so fiercely it seemed to consume itself. It would go on turning, indifferent to whether you kept pace or fell behind. And so, day after day, you matched its indifference with your own quiet resolve.
You learned to take pride, not in comfort, but in endurance, in knowing that when the wind howled hardest and the nights stretched longest, you were still there to see another morning. It was a rough apprenticeship, taught by cold earth, watchful animals, and the unblinking eyes of distant stars. But it forged in you something no dojo could replicate. You became a creature of the road, lean and deliberate, with senses tuned to the smallest tremor of risk or opportunity. In time, even your dreams adjusted, abandoning old images of village games or your mother's quiet hum, replacing them with endless paths stretching ahead, always ahead, pulling you onward into a future written in dust and hunger and steel. In time, the roads you walked began to thread through larger towns, places where stone walls replaced simple fences, and where banners of proud families rippled over wide gates. With them came new kinds of challenges, structures dedicated entirely to the art of combat, halls where men trained from dawn to dusk under the watchful eyes of instructors who prided themselves on long lineages and famous victories. These were the dojos, each with their own carefully nurtured reputations, each a small kingdom unto itself, where respect was measured by lineage scrolls and the gleam of well-maintained armor racks. You entered these places with little ceremony. Your clothes often marked you as a traveler who had seen too many lean nights. Your hair untrimmed, your face sun-darkened and sharp. Eyes would lift from polished floors as you stepped inside, taking in the stranger who carried himself with an unsettling confidence, who wore no formal crest on his tattered sleeve. Some students would smirk, sharing small mocking glances. Others stiffened, recognizing in your posture that you were not some lost farm boy looking for a story to bring home. It was always the same ritual, played out in countless variations across province after province. You offered a challenge, often with nothing more than a calm statement and a level gaze that left no room for polite refusal. The masters, tied by their own rigid codes of reputation, could not deny such a provocation without diminishing their standing. So they would gesture to a favored student or sometimes step forward themselves, eager to show how discipline and polished technique could dismantle the raw feral style of a wanderer.
Then the bouts began. The sound of bamboo shinai clashing, the sharp exhalations of breath, the shuffling, quick steps on wooden floors. These matches were never for mere sport, though the onlookers might have hoped otherwise. For you, each one was a test written in sweat and bruises, a lesson learned along the razor's edge of risk. Even when you won, and you won often, the victories were not clean. Welts bloomed across your ribs and arms, dark fingerprints of every misjudged distance, every poorly timed shift of weight. Your knuckles split open from impacts. Your shoulders ached from parrying blows that nearly slipped through. But you welcomed these injuries. Each mark was a teacher that spoke in pain, clarifying the smallest of your flaws. You would lie awake on unfamiliar mats after the day's matches, tracing tender spots along your forearms, replaying every exchange in your head with merciless scrutiny. Where had you overreached? When had you failed to read the telling flicker in your opponent's eyes before his strike launched? Slowly, those questions sharpened you. They stripped away habits that could kill you later, refining your instinct until it operated almost faster than thought. Not all of these encounters ended with you standing triumphant. There were times you found yourself stunned on the polished floor, the wind knocked from your lungs by a strike you hadn't anticipated. You learned humility in those moments, forced to taste the bitter edge of your own limitations. But unlike many who shrank from such revelations, you took them in with the same appetite you brought to your meager meals. Loss was only failure if it left you unchanged. Each painful outcome was cataloged, dissected, burned into memory, until the mistake that caused it became impossible to repeat. The students and masters you faced often watched you closely after the fights.
puzzling over how quickly you adapted. They saw a stranger come in with an unrefined, almost animal way of moving, only to leave days later with a smoother gait, a new trick folded into his approach, borrowed from the very style they had tried to defeat him with. Some found it disturbing, the way you seemed to devour the essence of their training and carry it away, adding it to a growing, shifting mosaic of techniques that answered to no single school's name.
In this way, your journey became less about distance measured in miles and more about scars accumulated, lessons internalized. Each dojo was another whetstone, each opponent a willing accomplice in your transformation, even if they did not realize it. By the time you left their gates, often under wary, sidelong glances, you were not the same wanderer who had arrived, hungry for combat and knowledge in equal measure. You were leaner in spirit as much as in body, more precise in your violence, your mind mapping the dance of blades with a clarity that startled even you. And always, beyond the bruises and fractured pride, there lingered a quiet certainty. You were becoming something that no single master could claim to have forged. You were building a style born of countless tiny humiliations and hard-won insights, each dojo leaving its fingerprints on you, even as you moved on, ready to test yourself against the next and the next, in a relentless pilgrimage that had no true end, only sharper, ever sharper edges. It wasn't long before whispers about you began to outpace your own travels. They slipped ahead of you along trade roads and through clusters of thatched roofs, carried by merchants who delighted in a good story as much as they did in fresh coin. They spoke of a young Ronin with a sun-browned face and eyes that missed nothing, a stranger who wandered from town to town, leaving dojo students nursing bruised ribs and rattled certainties. Depending on who told it, you were either a savage curiosity to be mocked or a quiet storm best avoided. In tea houses and markets, laughter often followed mention of your name. Some found the idea of an unaligned, half-wild youth striding into disciplined schools of swordsmanship almost comedic, a country brute with dirt still under his nails daring to test refined warriors trained under banners that had flown for generations. They painted you with broad strokes, the dirty boy from nowhere, swinging his wooden practice sword with reckless abandon. These men laughed because the thought of such audacity comforted them. It allowed them to file you neatly away as little more than an amusing tale, an exaggeration spun by travelers who liked to spice up mundane journeys. But laughter is a fragile armor. It cracked quickly when confronted by reality. Those who had stood across from you knew a different truth. Theirs were not stories peppered with fond smiles. They remembered the moment the smirk fell from their own faces as they realized the wild look in your eyes was not uncertainty, but a kind of lethal focus that refused to blink. They could still feel the shock traveling up their arms when their strikes were met with a block so firm it jarred their teeth. Could still taste the bitterness when your counter came a heartbeat later, impossibly fast, driving the breath from their lungs. Word changed because of these men. They carried home to their masters and peers not just tales, but the proof of your passage. Split lips, stiff backs, and the hollow quiet that settled over them when they tried to explain how someone with no official school could dismantle their carefully cultivated forms. Soon, the laughter dried up. It was replaced by side glances and hushed tones, by the uneasy prickle along a swordsman's neck when told you had been seen in the next province over. In inns where you stopped to eat thin broth or to rest your feet on splintered floors, conversations would sometimes falter as you entered. Patrons measured you quickly. Your rough clothes, the sword you carried like an old friend, the calm way you took in every exit before you even settled at a table. They would glance away and mutter to each other with forced casualness, as though trying to convince themselves you were only another hungry traveler.
Yet beneath the thin surface of their chatter, there pulsed a deeper current, one that knew hungry travelers did not sit so still, nor did they watch a room with such predatory patience. Children in markets began to play at being you. With sticks for swords, they would chase each other down dusty lanes, one boy lowering his voice to growl, "I'm the wolf with no master," before lunging at his squealing friends. Older men did not find these games amusing. They pulled their sons aside with stern warnings, telling them not to mock forces they didn't understand. Because for all their attempts to downplay it, your presence was becoming a shadow stretching long across the land. And you felt it too, though not with pride. If anything, it settled on your shoulders like an invisible mantle, another weight to carry alongside your bundle of meager belongings. Villages grew colder, their gates guarded by men who eyed you warily, hands never far from the hilts of their short swords. Invitations to spar often came edged with a nervous urgency, as if they wanted to prove something quickly, either to best you before your legend grew further, or to reassure themselves that your myth was only that, a story inflated by frightened tongues. Yet each time your wooden blade cracked against theirs, and you watched surprise bloom into panic. Each time your footwork turned their confident advances into stumbling retreats, you understood how shallow their laughter had always been. Underneath it lurked the same fear that drove all men. Fear of being exposed, of standing vulnerable before a truth sharper than any steel. And so your reputation evolved, from the dirty boy with reckless bravado to something more primal. They began to call you the wolf, a creature that wandered without ties, that chose its hunts and struck without warning. By then, you no longer needed to announce yourself. Your coming was preceded by rumors that filled the air before you even stepped into a new town. Some sought you out, eager for the chance to measure their blades against the legend. Others packed their belongings and left quietly, deciding that the coin they might earn wasn't worth discovering whether the stories were understated after all. So you walked on, carrying their whispers behind you like fading echoes, never pausing long enough to let the name they gave you become a cage. Because whatever else they believed, the truth was simpler. You were not hunting them to build a legend. You were hunting something inside yourself, some elusive mastery that could only be chased down blade by blade, bruise by bruise, on the dusty roads of a country still learning what kind of storm you truly were. They came to you with the stiff formality that tradition demanded, voices measured, words chosen with all the delicate flourishes of men who had spent their lives studying not only how to hold a sword, but how to bow with the perfect depth, how to compose flowery challenges that dripped with borrowed poetry. Invitations to duel were often penned on crisp paper, delivered by careful hands, sealed with symbols that spoke of old lineages and storied reputations. Even their faces, composed into masks of serene resolve, hinted that beneath it all, this was more ritual than reality. Another chance to uphold the fragile illusion that combat was somehow noble, that it could be contained within the gentle cage of etiquette. You accepted these challenges not because you respected the ceremony, but because they offered you something far simpler, far more honest. A contest stripped bare, where only skill and instinct decided who would stand afterward. So when you arrived at the appointed places, dawn-damp fields, quiet temple courtyards, riverbanks veiled in mist, you did so without fanfare. No retinue followed you. No poetry crossed your lips. You gave no long speeches to dignify what was about to happen. Opponents found this unsettling. They expected a measure of the dance, the respectful bows, the exchanged sentiments on honor and destiny, the careful acknowledgement of each other's schools. Some would frown when you offered them nothing but a calm, level stare. Others tried to draw you into the old ritual anyway, reciting stock phrases about respect and the impermanence of life, as if hoping to pin some greater meaning on the encounter. to make it about tradition rather than the stark truth that one of you would fall because the other was simply better prepared to survive. But you refused to pretend. You did not tilt your head in solemn apology for the violence to come. You did not offer reassurances that your spirits would meet again beyond this world. Your philosophy had no room for elegant illusions. It was built on what your hands had learned through countless bruises, on the sharp taste of your own blood at the corner of your mouth. It was ruthlessly simple. A duel was not a poem. It was a problem. One that only a clear eye, steady footwork, and absolute commitment could solve. And so, when their swords rose, you moved without hesitation. No graceful preamble, no seeking to impress with drawn-out flurries. You watched for the moment they revealed the smallest crack, the slight lift of a heel, the narrowing of eyes telegraphing a coming cut, and then you struck, swiftly, decisively. Often your blade met theirs with such raw force that tradition shattered along with their defense. Their practiced stances collapsed under the reality of impact. Breaths left them in startled gasps. Feet skidded across packed earth. The sound of your wooden sword or dull iron practice blade hitting flesh carried a different weight than any rehearsed recitation of honor. Those who watched later would say there was a cruelty to it, that you lacked the proper reverence for the art. They whispered that you were cold, even savage, but they missed the deeper truth. You were not cruel, you were honest. You did not dress the moment up in borrowed dignity because you respected the duel too much to hide it behind ceremony. Each fight was a collision of living wills, a test that ended only when one man's conviction faltered. Anything more was vanity. In these brief, brutal encounters, you found a purity that eluded those who tangled themselves in layered codes. You discovered that beneath all their fine words and ceremonial bows, most men still carried the same small, flickering fear, the instinctive terror of being unmade. And you respected that fear, not by cloaking it in ritual, but by meeting it head-on, offering no disguise for what stood between you and them. When you walked away afterward, your heartbeat steady, their forms crumpled or struggling to rise, you did not spare thoughts for their families or the stanzas of philosophy they might have muttered in private. Your only concern was the silent ledger you kept inside, another lesson etched into your muscles, another affirmation that clarity and unwavering intent would always triumph over pretty words. This was your way, not the way of flowery scrolls or carefully staged deaths under cherry blossoms. It was the way of directness, of reading the truth in a man's eyes in the instant before your sword found its mark. In this, you believed you came closer to the essence of the blade than any court poet ever could. Because in the end, it was never about how beautifully one fell. It was about who remained standing, breathing, ready for the next problem the world would inevitably throw. It was some time after the 50th duel, or the 100th, you stopped bothering to count, when you realized your victories no longer came from the sharpness of your blade or the strength coiled in your arms. Those had been essential once, when raw power and speed carried you through the narrowest of margins. But as the miles wore grooves into your feet, and your eyes grew sharper than the edge of any sword, something deeper began to guide your hand. You started to see men not just as bodies positioned in stances, but as intricate systems of fragile thoughts and barely contained impulses. Before the first clash of blades, your mind was already at work, parsing the subtlest clues. A slight flare of the nostrils that betrayed sudden doubt, a tightening around the mouth that revealed barely masked irritation, a shifting foot that broadcast an eagerness to close distance. These were openings more reliable than any physical flaw. It changed the entire nature of your encounters. Where once you stepped forward measuring angles and ranges, Now you also read the quiet theater that unfolded in every breath and blink. You discovered that men were rarely at peace when they fought. Even the most composed warriors carried small tremors inside. Memories of past failures, silent questions about whether today might be the day their luck ran thin. Pride was the easiest tell. Those who strode up with elaborate flourishes, who smirked at your unpolished closing or muttered remarks for the crowd to hear, were often brittle beneath the surface. You learned to give them nothing. No defensive posture, no sign of intimidation. Their need to be acknowledged, to force you into the same ceremonial dance, became their first unraveling. They mistook your plain readiness for ignorance, lunging in to demonstrate their superiority, never seeing how their vanity turned their precise techniques into predictable lines. Fear was more delicate, but just as visible if you knew where to look. A faint hitch in breathing, the way a hand flexed twice over a hilt before gripping firmly, a moment spent too long fixing a helmet strap. These were whispers of a mind already halfway lost. Against such opponents, you sometimes delayed your first strike by a single heartbeat, letting silence stretch thin and sharp around them. You watched as their own thoughts did the work, filling the quiet with visions of failure, until by the time you finally moved, they were reacting to ghosts inside their head rather than to you. You began to understand that combat was less a matter of overpowering an enemy's body and more a matter of gently, almost kindly, nudging their mind toward collapse. A faint step to the left could become a question posed to their instincts. Are you sure you're safe? A slight drop of your guard invited them to gamble, to reveal whether they trusted their judgment or feared a trap. Often it was the faintest of provocations, a narrowed eye, a relaxed shoulder that shouldn't have relaxed, that triggered them to strike before they were truly ready. When your sword finally moved, it was almost an afterthought, a punctuation mark to a conversation that had already reached its conclusion. By then, their certainty was already fractured. You merely confirmed what they had half decided themselves. It struck you one evening, sitting beneath a small shrine after a narrow match, how few blows actually mattered. Most duels were won long before skin was broken or breath was knocked from lungs. They were settled in the quiet tension between two minds, in the dance of assumptions and subtle betrayals that unfolded in the moments leading up to violence. This new awareness shifted how you carried yourself. You no longer walked into contests hungry to prove the force of your arm. Instead, you moved with the calm of someone solving an intricate puzzle. Each opponent was a knot of fears, hopes, pride, and fragile confidence. You simply watched where the threads pulled tightest, then gave the smallest tug to unravel them. By the time your blade found its mark, it felt almost merciful, an end to the private torment they had inflicted on themselves. And while others might have celebrated such cunning, you regarded it with a quiet solemnness, because in mastering the minds of your adversaries, you were forced to see yourself more clearly too, not just a wanderer with a sharp edge, but a student of human nature, forever cataloging how easily men revealed their deepest truths when faced with the specter of being undone. And so your mind became your keenest weapon, more precise than any sword your hands could wield. It guided your steps, shaped your silences, and delivered victory with a softness that often seemed at odds with the violence it achieved. In that paradox lay a profound power, one that would carry you forward into even greater tests, where understanding the fragile architecture of thought would prove far more decisive than the strength of any single cut. It was on a nameless stretch of road between two equally forgettable villages that the idea first found you, slipping into your thoughts as quietly as dusk crept across the low hills. You had stopped for the evening under a stand of crooked pines, their branches rattling overhead in a restless whisper. Your hands, restless too, traced the hilts at your sides. one longer, worn smooth by years of practice, the other, shorter, still bearing the subtle scars of rough shaping. Until then, the shorter blade had always felt like a companion to your primary sword, a last defense should your main hand fail, a tool for close work if pressed beyond the point of retreat. It was insurance, nothing more. Yet as you sat there watching the fading light catch on drifting needles, you wondered, why limit it to that? Why keep half your reach idle when it could instead become something more? An extension of the same ruthless intent that guided your dominant hand. The thought was a small spark, almost absurd in its audacity. All around you, warriors devoted their lives to mastering the art of one sword wielded with both hands, pouring endless hours into perfecting every angle and shift of balance. The very notion of dividing that focus, of placing a blade in each hand, seemed to insult centuries of proven discipline. But then, you had never walked comfortably within the lines others drew. That night, you rose before the moon climbed fully overhead, took up both swords, and began to move among the trees. Clumsy at first, painfully so. The extra weight in your offhand threw your center off kilter, turned your footwork into a chaotic scramble. Your left arm did not trust the blade it now held, flinched when it should have cut, lagged when it should have led. More than once you clipped your own leg, barked your knuckles against stubborn branches, felt the short blade twist awkwardly in your uncertain grip. But where others might have cursed the idea and returned to safer forms, you leaned into the mess of it. You stayed there long after your breath turned ragged, until sweat ran down your spine in cold rivulets, until your wrists ached from the awkward torque. The forest became your partner in this crude dance, its branches snapping back against you, the uneven ground forcing constant adjustments. Every misstep drove a lesson deeper into your muscles. Every sting across your skin was a small, necessary price for the knowledge your body was slowly learning. Days turned to weeks, villages passed by in indistinct blurs as you devoted yourself to this new pursuit. You rose with the sun and moved through empty fields, cutting at shadows that sprang from fence posts, jabbing at imaginary threats that lunged from behind rocks. Where other travelers might have paused to eat, you drilled, feeling for the first time how the two blades could become not separate instruments, but halves of a simple thought. Gradually, what had begun as desperate improvisation evolved into something deliberate. Your left hand, once hesitant, grew confident, discovering its own lines of attack independent from the right. Your steps adjusted, small pivots and slides that allowed both arms room to work, both blades to find openings without entangling each other. When you paused to breathe, you realized you were no longer fighting yourself, no longer waging two battles at once to keep balance and momentum. Instead, it began to resemble a kind of dance. Not graceful, not in the courtly sense, but fluid, responsive, almost eerily calm. One sword defended as the other struck, then reversed in an instant, turning what would have been moments of vulnerability into fresh opportunities. The chaos that had once tripped you smoothed out into a flowing sequence of motion and countermotion, each blade anticipating the other's need. The few who happened upon you during these solitary sessions often watched from a safe distance, their expressions wavering between fascination and unease. To them, it must have looked as though you were wrestling with invisible demons, your feet scuffing intricate patterns into the dirt, your blades whispering through air that offered no resistance. Sometimes you caught their eyes and offered nothing back but a nod, already retreating into the mental quiet where only the rhythm of your breathing and the cut of your swords existed. In time, you stopped thinking of it as wielding two weapons. It was simply your way, as natural to you as your own heartbeat, impossible to untangle into left and right, attack and defense. It lived in the small pivot of your heel, in the roll of your shoulders that let one blade slip behind the other for a hidden thrust. It was a style born not from books or revered scrolls, but from necessity, from hours alone with your failures until they transformed into something uniquely yours. So while other warriors clung to single blades and the comfort of tradition, you stepped beyond those boundaries, carrying with you a style that was still raw, still evolving, but already as dangerous as it was misunderstood. And though you rarely spoke of it, let others puzzle over your strange form or scoff at its unorthodox lines, you knew with the absolute certainty, born only of sweat and solitude, that this approach would one day cut through not just opponents, but entire legacies that thought themselves untouchable. By the time your feet had traced hundreds of dusty paths between provinces, by the time your hands bore scars that told a longer story than any boastful scroll could capture, something changed in the way the world received you. Your name began to move ahead of you like a cold wind, unsettling rooms before you ever stepped through their doors. Where once you were simply another wanderer arriving with a sword and a hungry look, now your presence carried a quiet gravity that bent people's thoughts before you spoke a single word. It began in the dojos, those proud houses where generations had labored to refine perfect stances, perfect bows, perfect lines of poetry recited before the blade. These schools thrived on reputation as much as on skill. Their masters wore renown like ornate armor, trusting that it would turn aside the doubts of lesser men. But your reputation was different. It was lean, stripped of the elegance that clung to ancestral crests, built instead on whispers of duels that ended with abrupt finality, of challengers who found themselves unmade, not by brute force, but by a calm intensity that picked apart their confidence before they even touched steel. When you entered these halls now, there was no easy laughter, no smug curiosity. The students fell silent, their practice faltering as they stole furtive glances at you from under lowered brows. Some tried to stand straighter, to recall their instructor's stern words about composure and dignity, but you could see it in the tightness of their throats, the way their hands fidgeted at their belts. Even the masters, many of them veterans of 100 drills and formal matches, watched you with guarded eyes, as though weighing whether to meet this challenge at all, or whether pride might demand it against better judgment. And when the duels came, they were never simple contests of technique. You had moved beyond that long ago. These encounters began long before blades cleared their scabbards. They started in the measured pace with which you approached the training floor, in the way your gaze settled on your opponent with unwavering stillness, not searching for flaws, but waiting for them to reveal themselves. Often they did, in the smallest betrayals, a sudden swallow, a quick dart of the tongue over dry lips, a hand that strayed up to adjust a collar that needed no adjusting. You had learned how devastating silence could be. You did not indulge in boasts or ritual declarations. Instead, you let the hush grow heavy, let it stretch into something that clawed at the nerves of everyone present. In that space, your opponents fought two battles, one with you, the other with the mounting echo of their own doubts. You could almost see the thoughts tumble through them. What if the stories were true? What if I am about to be laid open, not just in body, but in reputation, before my peers? When at last the fight began, many were already undone. They lunged too quickly, desperate to shatter the oppressive tension, to prove to themselves they still commanded the outcome. But their haste only fed your calm. You stepped aside, redirected, and punished their desperation with clean, efficient strikes that needed no flourish. The sound of your blade meeting its mark was often the first and last punctuation needed. Some never even got that far. There were duels where your opponent stood across from you, hands trembling ever so slightly on the hilt, until their resolve cracked entirely. They lowered their weapon without your urging, shame burning in their eyes as they offered a shallow bow and stepped aside. Onlookers might scoff, whispering that such men lacked heart, but you understood exactly what had broken in them. It was not the threat of your sword. It was the unbearable weight of your certainty, the way you carried yourself as someone who had already won before the challenge was ever spoken.
In this way, your fights evolved from contests of skill into something closer to psychological sieges. Dojos that once would have boasted of defeating any wanderer at their gates now murmured of you in hushed caution. Some closed their doors outright when they learned you were near, masters claiming illness or urgent travels to avoid the risk of having their school's prestige tarnished by an encounter they were no longer confident would favor them. You did not seek to humiliate them. This was simply the natural end of the road you had chosen. Where once you measured victory in bruises and battered ribs, now you recognized the more profound conquest was over the mind. A duel ended before the first step, before the first breath taken in readiness. This was a victory that lingered far longer in the hearts of those who witnessed it. So the stories spread even wider. They told of a swordsman whose presence alone could drain the courage from trained fighters, whose quiet composure weighed heavier than any armor. By then, you had stopped caring much for the stories. They were only distant ripples of who you were becoming. But the fact that entire schools quaked at the mention of your coming told you one truth you carried forward with the same sober clarity as your blades. The mind was the first battleground, and often the only one that truly mattered. You arrived at the edge of Kyoto with little more to announce you than the dust of the road clinging thick to your cloak and the tangled snarl of your hair, dark with sweat and travel. The city stretched before you like a living monument to refinement, its grand gates guarded by men in crisp livery, its narrow streets alive with the fragrance of incense drifting from countless temples and the bright rustle of silken sleeves. Lanterns swung overhead even by day, painting shifting patterns across polished merchant stalls that boasted lacquered goods, delicate fans, calligraphy so fine it seemed spun from dreams. If the villages and modest towns you had passed before were uneasy at your coming, Kyoto was something altogether different. This was no sleepy crossroads or provincial dojo guarding its small patch of pride. Kyoto was the heart of culture, of lineage, of 1,000 unbroken traditions that wound back through centuries. Here, men carried family crests like fragile treasures, each signet proof of generations spent honing not just skill with a sword, but an identity woven through poetry, etiquette, and the patronage of powerful lords. And at the center of this proud lattice stood the Yoshioka school, its name spoken almost as a prayer by lesser dojos, hoping to trace even a sliver of their legitimacy back to its hallways. The Yoshioka were more than instructors of technique. They were arbiters of how swordsmanship itself was meant to look, to sound, to breathe. Their students wore crisp uniforms embroidered with the family's stylized mark. Each step within those gates measured to avoid scuffing floors that had felt the tread of generations of esteemed masters. You walked into their world like a cold gust down a corridor heavy with incense. Your clothes were travel-stained, your skin darkened by long days beneath an indifferent sun, your hair an unruly mane that defied all attempts to disguise what you were, a wolf come down from the hills, lean with hunger and utterly unashamed. Merchants pulled their carts aside to give you room. Servants in fine livery eyed you with poorly masked disgust. You returned their looks with the same unblinking composure you had offered countless opponents, measuring, patient, a blade sheathed behind steady eyes. When you stood at the gates of the Yoshioka dojo, there was no flourish in your arrival. You did not send formal letters requesting audience, nor did you wait for the polite chain of introductions to weave its delicate way toward an invitation. You simply stepped through, your presence as direct as the road that had brought you. Students paused mid-drill, their bakken frozen mid-air. A hush swept through the courtyard, rippling from face to astonished face. They took in your dust-caked feet, the worn hilt of your sword, the faint smile that never quite touched your eyes. And behind that, something else flickered, confusion,
quickly edged by a defensive scorn. Who was this unwashed stranger who dared stride into Kyoto's most revered training ground as if he had every right? Some tried to brush it off with forced chuckles, muttering about brash country ronin too ignorant to grasp whose threshold they crossed. But beneath their brittle laughter lay a seed of worry, for your reputation had traveled ahead of you even here, carried by restless tongues eager to share tales of a swordsman who won fights before they began, who dismantled not just bodies but entire styles by refusing to play by their ornamental rules. You offered no apologies for your intrusion. Instead, you issued your challenge in calm, almost conversational tones, your words falling into the courtyard like stones dropped into still water. The instructors of the Yoshioka stiffened. Their honor gave them no choice but to accept. And perhaps, despite the rumors, they still believed their polished techniques, their centuries of ceremony, would humble you the way Kyoto had humbled countless outsiders before. What they failed to understand was that you did not come here to learn from them, nor to trade poetic salutes on the virtues of discipline. You came to break the illusion, gently, inevitably, with the same careful precision you used to probe the minds of opponents. You knew already what pride would make them do: overextend, underestimate, grow desperate when your strikes did not match the expected cadences of their carefully memorized forms. When the first of their chosen students stepped forward, resplendent in fresh robes, face set in a mask of rigid confidence, you gave him a single nod, an acknowledgement not of his lineage, but of the simple fact that he was here to test himself against reality. Then you moved, and the courtyard seemed to tighten around you, breaths caught in countless throats. Your attacks were not savage. They were measured, economical, crafted to open the smallest gaps and exploit them before thought could catch up. In moments, what should have been a proud demonstration of Kyoto's finest art was reduced to stumbling retreats, the sharp smack of wood on flesh, the shocked silence of witnesses watching years of reputation splinter under strikes too fluid, too indifferent to ceremony. When it was done, the Yoshioka's courtyard did not echo with admiring murmurs or the usual polite commendations for a bout well fought. Instead, it held only a brittle, wounded quiet. Even the cherry blossoms drifting from the courtyard trees seemed reluctant to settle, as if unsure this was still the hallowed ground of tradition or something newly humbled. You bowed once, not low, not in the exaggerated form they might have demanded, but with a respect rooted in the simple truth that you had given them your most honest self. Then you turned and walked back into the streets of Kyoto, leaving behind whispers that would coil through the city's elegant parlors and echo down its lantern-lit lanes for seasons to come. For them, it was a scandal, an insult that bruised the very heart of their cultural pride. For you, it was just another necessary step on a road that cared nothing for crests or pedigrees, only for the quiet, relentless refining of your own unorthodox edge. It didn't end with a single duel. Pride rarely allows for so clean a conclusion, especially when that pride has been cultivated over generations like a delicate garden, watered by reverence and carefully pruned by ritual. The Yoshioka family could no more accept your initial triumph in their courtyard than a lord could accept a beggar correcting his manner at a feast. Your victory had been too public, too sharp, and the rumors that spiraled outward from Kyoto's streets too eager to paint the once unquestioned dynasty in shades of humiliation. So it was almost inevitable that they sought to reclaim what you had stripped away. They came not with one challenger, but with brothers, each trained under the same rigorous codes, each raised to believe that their blood alone made them unassailable. They issued new challenges, formal and stiff with the bitterness of wounded pride, each more urgent than the last. This was no longer merely about defending technique. It was about salvaging the Yoshioka name from whispers that threatened to hollow it out from within. You accepted each without flourish, your calm agreement unsettling them in ways you no longer even needed to craft deliberately. They had hoped, perhaps, to see some sign that their growing fury had unsettled you, that their rigid ceremonies or the impressive lists of their ancestors would force you into a defensive awe. But all you offered was that same unwavering composure, eyes studying them with the same cool interest you might give to the shifting wind or the texture of a tree's bark. The first brother came with the confidence of someone who believed history itself would hold up his hand. His movements were textbook perfection, crisp cuts that demonstrated years of polished repetition. But repetition is not the same as intuition. He failed to read the faint invitations in your stance, the subtle slack in your shoulder that coaxed him to overreach. When he did, you answered with a swift, almost merciful correction, your blade striking with just enough force to knock aside his guard and send him sprawling in a single stunned motion. The gasps that rippled through the watching crowd were less about the speed of your victory than about how easily centuries of tradition had found itself face down in the dirt. The second brother came burning with rage, his face set in lines so rigid they looked carved from stone. Anger lent him power, but also stripped away caution. His strikes came hard and fast, chasing the specter of your reputation rather than the reality of your movements. You gave him space to exhaust that wild energy, your feet sliding across the courtyard in silent arcs, drawing him out until the red haze of his emotion left an opening so wide it seemed almost cruel to exploit. Your blade found his ribs in a crisp tap that dropped him to his knees, gasping more from shocked disbelief than pain.
Each victory was another fracture in the Yoshioka facade, spiderweb cracks racing through the lacquered surface of their legend. You could see it in the students who watched, their postures wilting as if some internal support had been cut. Even the onlookers from Kyoto's merchant class, men who prided themselves on patronizing the finest schools, exchanged uneasy glances, calculating how association with the Yoshioka might tarnish rather than elevate their standing. When it came time to face the third brother, the air itself felt heavy with a desperate finality. This was more than a match. It was the Yoshioka's last grasp at stitching their name back together before it split entirely under the weight of public scrutiny. He approached with an outward calm that only barely masked the tremor in his hands. Perhaps he thought to break the pattern by denying you any obvious openings, by waiting so long that your patience would slip first. But patience was by then your most carefully honed edge. When you finally moved, it was with the same simplicity that had unraveled all his brothers. No flourish, no sudden shout to draw focus. Just a clean step inside his reach, a pivot that positioned your offhand blade to disrupt his guard, and a strike that caught him across the shoulder hard enough to shatter his resolve. He dropped his weapon with a startled cry, clutching the spot where your blade had landed as though it burned. The courtyard fell silent, but for the faint sigh of Kyoto's distant traffic. The city outside continuing its elegant rhythms, unaware or uncaring of the private collapse happening within these storied walls. You offered a short nod, not gloating, simply acknowledging the end of something inevitable, and turned to leave. There was no triumph written on your face, no indulgence in petty taunts. You walked away with the same calm, measured steps you had arrived with, your dusty cloak whispering behind you, your twin swords resting easy at your hips. Behind you, the Yoshioka name lay in scattered pieces, their brothers defeated one after another, their legacy now haunted by the memory of a wanderer who neither sought to humiliate them nor cared enough to celebrate. It was perhaps this indifference that cut deepest of all, proof that you had come not to challenge them out of personal vendetta, but simply as another stop on your relentless pursuit of something greater than reputation.
and in leaving them with only the echo of your footfalls, you ensured that Kyoto would whisper of their downfall for years to come, each retelling tightening the knot of their disgrace. They couldn't let it end there. Pride, wounded so deeply, does not simply curl up and accept the scar. It festers, plotting, desperate to reclaim what was lost, even if it means abandoning every principle once held sacred. The Yoshioka had tasted too much humiliation to walk away with dignity. Behind the lacquered doors of their battered dojo, shame fermented into something poisonous, warping their storied sense of honor into the brittle desperation of men who felt they had nothing left to lose. Word reached you in cautious fragments, carried by merchants and timid students who spoke with eyes darting over their shoulders. They said the Yoshioka clan planned a final answer to your string of quiet devastations, a blow that would not rely on fair contests or the fragile psychology of ritualized duels. This was to be a lesson writ in overwhelming force, a way to cleanse their tarnished name by ensuring you did not walk away to add new chapters to your growing legend. But you had spent too long studying the subtleties of human nature to be surprised. The moment victory becomes too costly to achieve cleanly, men look for dirtier means. Their plan was obvious in every tremor of rumor, in every uneasy hush that fell when your name came up near Kyoto's markets. They meant to lure you to a final arranged duel, this time not with a single proud brother, but with an ambush of hidden blades waiting to turn one man's test into a one-sided slaughter. So, you came early. Long before the appointed hour, while the city's alleys still yawned quiet and the rooftops glowed with the first faint pink of day, you walked the narrow lanes toward the site they had chosen. Your pace was unhurried, as though this were just another morning's aimless wandering. Your expression so calm that fishmongers setting up stalls scarcely spared you a glance. Inwardly, though, every sense was tuned to the currents of unease that pooled in doorways, to the faint scuff of feet that did not quite match the rhythms of honest city bustle. You found them scattered along the edges of the small clearing, a courtyard outside a rented temple hall that should have been a serene place for poetry readings or elegant gatherings. Instead, you noted too many figures standing awkwardly behind fences, too many supposed spectators with their hands resting on hilts, eyes glittering with tension rather than curiosity. They did not expect you yet. Their plan relied on spectacle, to greet you with measured bows and solemn introductions, to lull you into stepping neatly onto the killing floor at the exact moment dozens of concealed swords would leap from shadow. They were still positioning themselves for the performance. What they hadn't accounted for was your refusal to ever be led. Without warning, you stepped into the courtyard with the same quiet composure you had brought to countless honest duels. Only this time, there was no waiting for the first formal exchange. Your hands moved in a blur, one blade slicing low to rip the footing from a would-be attacker lunging from behind a pillar, the other cutting upward in a vicious arc that turned a hidden thrust from your left into a howl of agony. The air seemed to explode with startled shouts, metal rasping free of scabbards too late to coordinate into any unified strike. You did not pause. Their trap relied on hesitation, on the moment of polite acknowledgement that had preceded every formal bout. But you offered them nothing of the sort. Instead, you flowed through the courtyard like the very principle of disruption made flesh. Your twin blades never still, each pivot and step driving you deeper into their collapsing ranks. Men shouted your name in tones strangled by panic rather than triumph. Their strikes clashing not against your flesh, but against the ghost of where you had been an instant before. Blood splattered across the smooth flagstones, bright and startling in the delicate dawn light. The Yoshioka men fell in staggered heaps, clutching at shoulders and thighs, some simply dropping their swords and stumbling backward as if distance alone might spare them from your cold efficiency. You moved without anger. This was no furious slaughter, but a clean dismantling of a plan that had mistaken numbers for inevitability. Every cut was deliberate, controlled, never wasted. When it was over, the courtyard stood in hushed ruin. The hired fighters and lesser students who had survived cowered along the walls, eyes wide with the dawning realization that the very reputation they'd sought to destroy had only grown more terrible by the attempt. The Yoshioka's last desperate gamble lay scattered in moans and dropped weapons, their hopes of reclaiming honor leaking into the cracks between ancient stones. You offered no speech, no parting condemnation. To do so would have been to pretend this was ever about words. Instead, you wiped your blades with the calm precision of a man finishing a daily task, then slid them home. As you walked out under the rising sun, the few left standing pressed themselves back against doorframes, flinching as if your passing might cut them anew. Thus the Yoshioka school was left in more than physical ruin. Their line, once the very pillar of Kyoto's martial pride, now stood hollowed by the same arrogance that had once fed it. And you continued down the road with the same measured stride as always, unburdened by triumph, already seeking the next horizon that might offer a challenge untarnished by fear. For you, the real victory lay not in leaving them broken, but in how thoroughly they had revealed themselves to be so before your blades ever touched them. Word of what happened to the Yoshioka spread with a speed that no courier could match. It slipped through Kyoto's bustling streets, leaped over the thresholds of merchant estates, wound its way into the quiet chambers of lords who fancied themselves connoisseurs of martial prowess. What began as a string of unsettling rumors soon solidified into something colder, harder, a truth repeated so often it gained the weight of certainty. No one could stop you. Not famed dojo lineages with centuries of scrolls behind them, not well-born brothers raised from childhood to embody the art of the sword, not even the carefully laid snares of a desperate school willing to gamble every last shred of honor on your downfall. One by one, each attempt had ended the same way, in silence, in stunned eyes following your departing figure, in blood staining stones that once hosted elegant demonstrations of form. So the challenges changed. Where once men had lined up eagerly to test themselves against the rising legend of your name, now they hesitated. Invitations grew less frequent. Formal challenges from respected schools gave way to muttered suggestions that perhaps you were best left alone. Even the more reckless sorts, ambitious young warriors drunk on the idea of earning glory by toppling you, found their courage curdling when they stood in your calm presence and felt that unblinking regard settle on them, weighing and measuring before they'd even drawn steel. It was said that small retainers began cautioning their samurai against seeking you out, fearing that the loss of even a single promising fighter could tilt fragile power balances in distant border conflicts. Some lords, upon hearing you had entered their territories, quietly advised their guards to offer you no insult, to let them pass unchallenged. Better to risk the murmurs of cowardice than the certainty of shame that would come from seeing their best cut down by a ronin who seemed to drift through every duel untouched in spirit, if not always in skin.
There were still fights, of course. Always there were fights. Lesser men, driven by greed or desperation, tried to seize your growing fame for themselves. You dispatched them without hatred or delight, just as you might cut through underbrush that blocked your path. Each encounter felt shorter than the last, your movements honed by so many hundreds of contests that your body acted now on a kind of silent instinct, reading intentions before they were fully formed in your opponent's eyes. The victories piled up. They came so effortlessly that there was no time for triumph, only a quiet, creeping awareness that each new bout taught you less than the one before.
The men who faced you began to seem almost interchangeable, their fears and small bursts of arrogance drawn from the same narrow well. You found yourself noticing more and more how quickly their spirits broke, not under the press of your blades, but under the weight of your calm, your utter refusal to be rattled. In that growing ease, however, something else unfurled inside you, a peculiar hollowness that no amount of fresh victories could fill. Once, your heart had raced with fierce clarity when stepping into a duel. Once there had been a fire that burned not just to prove yourself, but to discover the edges of your own limitations. Now, the edge felt strangely distant. Each fight unfolded as if preordained, the outcome sealed long before the first swing. The danger that had once thrilled you was now an old, predictable friend. And so you walked from province to province under skies that never changed, cutting down men who had convinced themselves they could stand in your way, their bodies falling with scarcely more resistance than the dry leaves that spun across your path. Armies might have feared your approach, governors might have ordered their men to step aside rather than provoke you, but none of that granted the sense of revelation you once sought. In the cold, unspoken spaces between battles, a subtle question began to haunt you. If no one could stop you, then what meaning remained in continuing to swing your sword? Each perfect cut, each flawless victory seemed to echo in the hollows of your chest, leaving behind not satisfaction, but a silence that felt deeper than any wound. And still you moved on, carried forward not by hunger for triumph, but by something you could not yet name. Perhaps the faint hope that somewhere ahead waited a contest worthy not just of your skill, but of your spirit, a test that might finally restore the sharp urgency to your blood. It was in a small, smoky tea house perched beside a bustling river crossing that you first heard his name spoken with the kind of wary awe that once only followed yours. Two merchants sat hunched over steaming cups, their conversation meant to be private, but carried clearly to your ear by the careless acoustics of a quiet afternoon. They whispered of a swordsman whose blade was so swift it was said to catch birds mid-flight, whose long nodachi gleamed like a thread of moonlight drawn through mortal hands. Sasaki Kojiro. The name fell into you like a stone dropped into deep water, sending slow ripples outward that broke against places inside you long undisturbed. It had been so many miles, so many effortless duels, since last you felt that particular quickening in your chest, a subtle tightening that was not fear, but a profound alertness. A sensation that here, perhaps, stood someone who might look back at you across the narrow space of a drawn line and truly see you. The rumors multiplied as you traveled. In every new town, under lanterns swaying in the dusk breeze, men spoke of Kojiro's grace, of how his technique, called the Tsubame Gaeshi, could slice so fluidly upward that it was almost impossible to read, let alone block. They said he moved like water slipping over stones, unhurried yet unstoppable, smiling always as though the duel were simply a formality to be observed before returning to more pleasant pursuits. Unlike the bloated boasts you'd grown used to hearing from local champions, these stories did not smell of drunken exaggeration. They carried the crisp tension of truth, of fresh memories spoken by men still rattled by what they had witnessed. For the first time in longer than you cared to admit, you felt anticipation thread itself through your days. It quickened your steps along narrow roads flanked by rice fields. It drew your eyes further ahead on each horizon. This was not the dull repetition of cutting down hopeful youths or overconfident retainers. This was the scent of genuine challenge, something sharp enough to slice through the gathering haze of your own quiet discontent. When finally you found yourself seated across from an old retainer who had once served as a messenger between samurai households, he spoke of Kojiro with the small involuntary shiver of someone recalling a near brush with fire. He told you how Kojiro had built his fame not on crushing schools or humiliating lines of brothers, but through a string of elegant duels where each opponent seemed almost honored to lose, so breathtaking was the manner of their undoing. There was poetry to Kojiro's victories, a beauty that left even the defeated murmuring of the privilege to have tested themselves against him. And so you sought him, not with brash declarations, not with the pointed challenges that once carried your name ahead of you like a storm. This was different. This was two trajectories, each sharpened by countless small trials, now inevitably bending toward intersection. The rumors grew clearer as you closed the distance. He was waiting on Genryujima, a small island whispered about in half-fearful, half-reverent tones, its shores already crowded by those who hoped to witness a clash that might live on in story long after both of you were gone. Strangely, as you prepared your few belongings and inspected your swords, you realized you were smiling. A small, tight curve of the lips, the first honest flicker of joy you had felt since your earliest contests. This was what you had chased down every road, what your solitude and your endless string of easy victories had starved you of. An opponent who might reflect back at you all the quiet rigor, the ceaseless honing, the restless hunger that had defined your every waking step. Kojiro's name was more than a promise of danger. It was a promise of revelation, of discovering, perhaps at last, the true extent of what you had become. And if that knowledge lay at the far side of his blade, so be it. Better to meet it fully, with eyes wide open and every breath alive with purpose, than to drift forever through a world of frightened men who laid down their swords before the first strike ever fell. So you boarded the small boat that would carry you to Genryujima, with a heart that beat not with dread, but with something sharper. A hunger that had waited patiently through countless hollow victories for this precise moment to be fed. The small boat rocked gently beneath your feet as it cut across the narrow channel, its oars dipping into the water with a rhythm that seemed impossibly calm given where it was taking you. Genryujima rose ahead, little more than a modest sweep of sand and sparse grass, yet the air around it felt taut with expectation. Word had spread far beyond Kyoto. Merchants, samurai, even cautious retainers from distant provinces had gathered on its shores, eager to witness something they could boast of seeing long after both you and Kojiro were dust in unmarked graves. As the boat slid onto the beach, you stepped out with a deliberate ease that belied the quiet storm moving through your veins. In your hand was not your famed long blade, nor even the paired swords that had become so closely identified with your name. Instead, you carried a simple wooden oar, roughly carved, its heft awkward in any hand trained for the graceful balance of a katana. Murmurs raced through the assembled watchers at the sight, soft, incredulous laughter from some, uneasy coughs from others. To them, it looked like a madman's insult, the final arrogant flourish of a warrior who had grown too certain of his legend. But this was no careless whim. You had chosen the oar with the same calculating mind that had read 1,000 subtle tells in the faces of opponents long before blades ever crossed. You knew Kojiro's style, knew of the long nodachi he favored, the extra reach he wielded like an artist's brush, painting elegant arcs that lured lesser men into fatal distance. To meet that length with your own blade would have been to concede half the battle to him before the first step. The oar, heavy and deceptively blunt, extended your reach past expectation, turned your disadvantage into a question he would not be prepared to answer. When Kojiro finally appeared on the opposite shore, striding down toward you with a composure that seemed to shimmer around him like heat off summer stones, the crowd parted as though pushed by a shared breath. He was taller than you had imagined, with a refined, almost regal bearing, his long blade resting against his shoulder as though it weighed no more than a strand of silk. His eyes, when they met yours, sparkled not with anger or contempt, but something closer to delight, a swordsman who saw at last the promise of a challenge to match his own restless perfection. Yet even that poise faltered for the briefest instant when he took in the oar. A flicker across his features, quickly mastered, but you saw it all the same. Confusion, then the faintest tightening of his jaw. Already, the carefully composed lines of his battle were being redrawn by your hand. The two of you faced each other on the sand without bow or poem, the air thick enough that each shallow breath felt like drawing through cloth. Around you, the crowd leaned in, mouths parted, hands clutching at robe fronts, as if afraid to even whisper and miss the pivot point of history. When the fight began, it was so sudden that many watching didn't grasp what had happened until it was already over. Kojiro moved first, his nodachi a flash of silver too quick for most eyes to track, sweeping low to high, in that famed tsubame gaeshi meant to open you from hip to shoulder in a single clean stroke. But your patience, your days of reading countless minute betrayals in posture and breath, had prepared you for precisely this flourish. You stepped in, not back as so many before you had, granting him the full, graceful arc of his strike, but in, where the reach of his long blade became a cumbersome liability. Your oar came down in a grooval, almost ugly angle, sacrificing elegance for devastating efficiency. The wood cracked against the side of Kojiro's head with a force that rippled visibly down through his neck and shoulders, the sharp report echoing across the stunned island like a handclap from some unseen, monstrous spectator. He staggered, the smile finally sliding from his lips, his long sword dropping from nerveless fingers to dig into the sand. For a breath, just one, the world seemed to hold perfectly still, as though it too needed to understand how a legend could be so abruptly unmade. Then he crumpled, the proud lines of his body folding in on themselves, leaving nothing behind but the hushed disbelief of onlookers who could not quite reconcile what their eyes insisted was true. You did not gloat. You did not so much as glance toward the crowd that now regarded you with a silence so profound it felt like standing in a temple after all prayers had been spent. Instead, you turned away, letting the oar rest across your shoulders, your gaze fixed again on the horizon that had always mattered more than any single contest. Because for all the stories they would later tell of how you bested Sasaki Kojiro with nothing but a boatman's implement, of how your cunning reduced the greatest living swordsman to a footnote, it was never truly about the spectacle. For you, it had always been about the question: was there anyone out there who could push you beyond the silent edge you carried inside? Kojiro had come close, close enough to awaken the old thrill, to remind you that mastery was a pursuit lined with ghosts of those almost capable of showing you the limits of your own reach. And even as you left Ganryujima behind, its sands stained and its watchers forever changed, a quiet part of you mourned that the answer, yet again, was no. When you finally stepped away from the spot where Kojiro's body had crumpled into the sand, the world seemed to breathe out all at once, and then hold that breath, as if unsure whether it was permitted to exhale. The gathered crowd, moments ago a sea of hushed gasps and tightening grips on robe sleeves, stood in stunned stillness. Their faces bore the same disbelieving question that had already begun to echo inside your own chest. Was this truly how it ended? Could something so vast in anticipation collapse into silence so suddenly, so absolutely? Even the gulls circling above the beach seemed caught off guard. They hung in the air, wings half folded against the rising breeze, their usual sharp cries swallowed by a hush that pressed against your eardrums like water. The gentle slap of waves against the rocks, the distant rustle of trees on the higher ridge of the island. These small sounds rose awkwardly to fill the void left behind, inadequate stand-ins for the raw spectacle so many had traveled to witness. Some men tried to speak, traders who had come expecting a tale to sell, minor samurai hoping to carry home the scent of greatness. But their words died on dry tongues. They watched you with a careful, almost frightened reverence, as if uncertain whether this calm figure walking away across the sand was entirely human. You passed close enough to see the trembling in their throats, the way their eyes darted down rather than risk being snared by yours. And inside, where your heartbeat had once galloped in joyful anticipation of meeting an equal, there stretched only an unsettling quiet. You had sought this duel with a hunger that bordered on desperation, following rumor after rumor, chasing the promise that finally, after countless hollow victories, here was a man who could force you to the ragged edge of your skill, who might even stand atop it and show you something beyond yourself. Kojiro had come close. His blade was poetry in motion, his mind sharp enough to read dangers most never saw. For the briefest moments in your clash, you felt your own limits ripple, tested as they hadn't been in years. But then he fell. And what remained was not triumph. It was a hollow echo of what might have been, a profound absence where you had hoped to feel the electric revelation of truly being matched. The realization crept through you with a chilling gentleness. There would likely be no one else. The roads stretching ahead would carry you to fresh duels, yes, to new faces bearing swords and ambitions, but not to equals. Not to that rare, bright friction of standing opposite a mind and body so attuned that the outcome balanced on a breath. In defeating Kojiro, you had not simply ended one of Japan's greatest swordsmen, you had quietly severed your own last tether to the possibility of being surprised. So you continued your slow walk along the beach, feeling the sand shift beneath your soles, listening to the tiny collapse of each footprint behind you. The crowd parted without a sound, their heads dipping in instinctive deference, though you offered no glance to meet their wary awe. In that heavy, collective stillness, broken only by the cautious return of a few bold seabirds, you understood that this silence was not just theirs. It was yours, too, a vast interior hush that might never be disturbed again. Long after you boarded the waiting boat, as the oars cut smooth crescents into the water and the island slipped back into the distance, you sat with that silence nestled deep in your chest. It was not grief exactly, nor was it pride. It was the calm that follows a storm so intense the very air feels emptied of possibility. A subtle mourning for a question forever left unanswered. What heights might you have reached if there truly existed someone who could stand wholly as your mirror? But the sea rolled on beneath you, uncaring, just as it always had. And so, eventually, did you. Carrying forward not in search of rivals now, but driven by something more private, an unspoken promise to yourself that even if the world held no one who could test your edge again, you would still hone it, still explore its furthest reach, because that journey was no less essential simply for being walked alone. In the days and weeks after you left Ganryujima behind, the world seemed to fade by subtle degrees. Colors lost a certain vividness. The bright banners of distant temples fluttered less urgently in the wind. Even the metallic tang of blood, so familiar after countless duels, seemed somehow dulled. You traveled still. Your feet knew no other life, but each step landed on a road that felt strangely weightless, as though the earth itself had forgotten how to push back. In the days and weeks after you left Ganryujima behind, the world seemed to fade by subtle degrees. Colors lost a certain vividness. The bright banners of distant temples fluttered less urgently in the wind. Even the metallic tang of blood, so familiar after countless duels, seemed somehow dulled. You traveled still, your feet knew no other life, but each step landed on a road that felt strangely weightless, as though the earth itself had forgotten how to push back.
Without realizing it, you drifted farther and farther from the crowded arteries of Japan's busy provinces. Towns grew smaller, scattered like pale freckles across vast stretches of farmland and rough hills. The people you passed were simpler too. Peasants more concerned with the moods of weather than the rumors of swordsmen. Merchants who measured success in sacks of rice rather than tales of whose blade was quickest. They offered polite nods and the occasional cautious bow, but none recognized you. Their ignorance was almost a relief. In their eyes you saw no trembling awe, no dread wrapped in courtesy, just fleeting curiosity before they returned to their honest burdens. But you carried your own weight, a load invisible to anyone else. It pressed on your shoulders each dawn, tightened in your chest each dusk. Without Kojiro, without even the ghost of someone who might match the restless edge inside you, there was no longer any question of who you needed to surpass. The only true adversary left was yourself, and that was a far more relentless contest than any duel fought on open ground. Your mind became both your battlefield and your opponent. Memories replayed themselves with ruthless precision. The slight arch of Kojiro's brow before he struck, the whisper of his blade carving air, the way silence had swallowed the island in the heartbeat after your oar connected. Again and again you faced that moment, searching for something you might have missed, a hesitation, a hidden vulnerability in your own spirit. Because if you could not find your limit in him, perhaps it was buried deeper, waiting to be revealed only by your own relentless probing. So you fought shadow battles. Each evening, you cut down invisible foes beneath the dark canopy of cedars, your twin swords tracing arcs lit only by moonlight. You moved until sweat soaked your worn clothing and your breath came in ragged gusts. At times, you struck so fiercely against phantom strikes that your wrists shuddered and your knuckles split open anew. Yet no matter how perfectly you parried or how ruthlessly you advanced on these figments, no echo of true challenge ever answered you. In quieter moments, sitting alone by meager campfires that barely pushed back the night, you felt something colder begin to stir. A suspicion that maybe it was never about finding someone to match you. Maybe it had always been about the simple, unyielding fact that you could not stop. That the road itself was a necessity woven into your marrow, not because it might one day lead to a worthy rival, but because you did not know how to exist without that ceaseless testing. So you fought shadow battles. Each evening, you cut down invisible foes beneath the dark canopy of cedars, your twin swords tracing arcs lit only by moonlight. You moved until sweat soaked your worn clothing and your breath came in ragged gusts. At times, you struck so fiercely against phantom strikes that your wrists shuddered and your knuckles split open anew. Yet no matter how perfectly you parried or how ruthlessly you advanced on these figments, no echo of true challenge ever answered you. In quieter moments, sitting alone by meager campfires that barely pushed back the night, you felt something colder begin to stir. A suspicion that maybe it was never about finding someone to match you. Maybe it had always been about the simple, unyielding fact that you could not stop. That the road itself was a necessity woven into your marrow. Not because it might one day lead to a worthy rival, but because you did not know how to exist without that ceaseless testing. This understanding brought with it a peculiar loneliness, one deeper than the absence of companions or the long miles between villages. It was the loneliness of being trapped within a mind that would never stop sharpening itself, a heart that could not unclench from the anticipation of a threat that might never come again. You had become both hunter and hunted, endlessly circling the walls of your own discipline, seeking cracks that perhaps no longer existed. And yet you did not turn back, did not lay aside your blades to settle among simple folk who might have offered warmth and small comforts. The road still pulled at you, even if it no longer promised revelation.
Perhaps some part of you clung to the faint chance that beyond the next ridge, across the next river, there waited another figure, a stranger with steady eyes and a patient stance, whose blade would whisper through the air in a way that finally made your heart leap as it once had. But if that figure never came, you would continue regardless, because somewhere along the way, the pursuit itself had become indistinguishable from who you were. Even if the only remaining battles lay in the silent corridors of your own thoughts, you would keep testing, keep refining, carving away at yourself long after all external threats had fallen away. For in that quiet war within, you still found the closest thing to truth you had ever known. In the end, it was not a duel or a battlefield that claimed the last of your restless years, but a cave, a hollow mouth in the gray rock of Iwato, near a village that would scarcely have warranted a dot on any official map. They called it Reigondo. To anyone else, it was just a shadowed cleft in the mountainside where cool drafts curled out and birds nested in narrow ledges. But to you, it was precisely enough. Enough to be apart from the world's fragile ceremonies. Enough to be alone at last with the echo of your own questions. By then, your hair had gone to iron and ash. The lines around your eyes ran deep, cut not just by age, but by long contemplation and countless hours of squinting across the bright edge of a blade at men who would not leave that space alive. Your hands, still calloused from decades gripping hilts, trembled slightly now, not from weakness, but from the accumulation of thousands upon thousands of small impacts, each one a lesson you had once paid for in bright flashes of pain. They were hands that could still split a reed clean in the air, but more often they now closed around a brush instead of a sword.